Good afternoon. My name is Greg Krasovsky, an American attorney of Ukrainian descent. Today's video is about the legal services that my law offices offer to Ukrainians who are seeking entry into the U.S., especially Ukrainian refugees that are fleeing the current military conflict with Russia and all its devastating consequences for the Ukrainian civilian population and infrastructure. If you know someone, obviously a resident or a citizen of Ukraine, who wants to seek refuge or temporary protected person status in the U.S., or is seeking a visa into the U.S., please feel free to refer them to my law offices. We can provide them legal advice and services and representation to help them enter the United States legally as quickly as possible. Now, many Ukrainian refugees fleeing Ukraine generally flee through adjoining countries such as Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Moldova. Afterwards, these Ukrainian refugees who choose not to stay in those countries or don't have an opportunity to do so either seek refugee status generally in countries that are members of the EU. Some of them are also seeking refugee status, temporary protected person status in the United States, especially given the large Ukrainian diaspora that we have in the United States. So the goal is to enter the United States lawfully. Before you'd be able to seek a tourist visa or a work visa or other types of visas at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Needless to say, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev has been closed for some time. Initially was relocated to Lviv in West Ukraine, formerly known as Lemberg, when it was a part of Poland. But that embassy is now closed. Ukraine-related cases are being handled generally at the U.S. Consulate General in Frankfurt, Germany. Some cases are still being handled in the countries where the Ukrainian refugees happen to be located. For those Ukrainians who are seeking entry into the U.S., you can apply for humanitarian parole with USCIS, that's United States Citizens Immigration Services, by submitting the relevant application and fee. The fee, if I'm not mistaken, is $500 some. That application is submitted to USCIS in the United States. They have a lockbox in Texas where you can submit documents. Generally, these parole applications are then reviewed and acted upon by the Humanitarian Affairs Branch that's located in Washington, D.C. Ukrainian citizens and residents can also request humanitarian parole from the State Department. The State Department does have the authority to request humanitarian parole from USDHS Customs and Border Patrol. That's the agency that ultimately makes a decision whether you're going to be admitted into the U.S. Either with a visa, a travel document, or on humanitarian parole grounds. So, as I've said before, if you're applying for humanitarian parole, you can apply with USCIS, or you can apply with the State Department. But regardless of which one of those agencies makes a decision on your application, that if they make a positive decision, they're going to forward that request to Customs and Border Patrol, USCBP. A number of Ukrainians have been applying to Customs and Border Patrol directly at ports of entry. In other words, any airport at which you arrive, or a marine port, if you're traveling to the U.S. by boat. For instance, I guess from the Bahamas or from other countries where you have boat travel. Or at land borders. The U.S. has land borders with Mexico and Canada. Now, the trick then is, well, how do you reach those borders? A number of Ukrainians have elected to travel to Mexico because Mexico requires only electronic visas. You can obtain an electronic visa and go to Mexico and then travel to the U.S. border and present yourself to Customs and Border Patrol and request humanitarian parole based on the current military situation, war, invasion, whatever you call it, in Ukraine. And it's up to CBP to make a decision whether they're going to admit you or not. Before, you've also had limitations on admission of aliens to the U.S., so a decision can be made whether they're eligible for temporary protected status or asylum, refugee status. But those things were curtailed by the COVID-19 pandemic and regulations that are known under Title 42. A memo has been issued recently that allows CBP to process applications from Ukrainians as an exception to Title 42 restrictions, and very soon Title 42, from what we understand as immigration attorneys, is going to that's going to expire soon. So those are the options. If you're Ukrainian and you're eligible to receive a tourist visa to the U.S., B1 or B2 visitor visa, you can apply for that as well in the country where you're located, and hopefully at the U.S. Embassy in the country where you're located, and hopefully that embassy will be able to process your application, regardless of whether you're in Germany or someone else. Those embassies but remember, if you apply for a visitor visa, you have to overcome what's called migratory intent. In other words, you have to demonstrate to the State Department that you're not likely to become an immigrant to the U.S., that you have sufficient ties to your country, sufficient assets, work, relatives, things like that. You're a member of organizations. If you can't overcome the presumption of migratory intent, then you're going to be denied a visitor visa. Those Ukrainians who are seeking entry to the U.S. based on, for instance, immigrant visas, what this means is they have to have a relative who's going to sponsor them. A husband, a wife, a parent, an adult child, or a fiancé. And now for fiancés, it's a different category. We'll touch that later, and obviously those Ukrainians. For instance, if you have an American citizen relative or a lawful permanent resident who can file the petition for an immigrant petition, that's the I-130. That petition is filed with USCIS in the United States, or, given certain exceptions, can also be filed at the local embassy where you're located. And that's the option that people are currently exploring as well, given the emergency circumstances. But it takes a while for those petitions to be reviewed by USCIS, and once they've been approved, they're going to be forwarded to the National Visa Center, where then you have to submit documents confirming, your civil documents such as your birth certificates, your relationship to the relative's U.S. citizenship. He submits his U.S. passport, certificate of naturalization, or consular report of birth abroad, or a U.S. birth certificate, things like that. Then also an affidavit of support has to be filed. In other words, the sponsoring American has to show that he or she have sufficient means to support you in the event after you arrive in the U.S. and before you become a U.S. citizen, you end up being poor and applying for public benefits. Within that affidavit of support, the American relative takes on an obligation in the event you do apply for public benefits and the government pays them, that the American relative will reimburse the U.S. government for any benefits that you've received. Cash benefits, medical insurance, and obviously that can be substantial. There's certain poverty guidelines that you have to meet in terms of your income and things like this. So once all these documents are submitted to the National Visa Center and reviewed, then they're forwarded to the local embassy where the Ukrainian national is located for what's called consular processing. And part of consular processing is reviewing all the documentation that you've submitted to the National Visa Center. making sure that you meet the medical requirements to enter the U.S. And that means a medical examination has to be set up for you with a civil surgeon who has been approved by the State Department or U.S. Immigration Services. And that civil surgeon reviews your medical history, makes sure that you're not a medical threat to the U.S. For instance, you don't have tuberculosis, you don't have other communicable, transmittable diseases that could pose a health hazard. You would also have to get your COVID-19 vaccination. They would also review other important vaccines that you need to have to enter the U.S., and the list of those vaccines is available. And once the civil surgeon is satisfied that you've met all the medical criteria, the civil surgeon fills out a particular form, and that form is given to you in a sealed packet, or in certain cases transmitted electronically to the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. consulate that's processing your immigrant visa application. Once you've completed your medical examination and you've gathered all the required documents, an interview is scheduled for you at the U.S. consulate. The consular officials meet you. They review original documents that you've presented them, for instance, such as a criminal background check. In other words, you need to have a particular official letter from your local law enforcement agency confirming that you don't have a criminal record. Or if the criminal record that you do have, it's not for crimes that would bar your entry into the U.S. And once the interview takes place and the consular officials are satisfied that you've met all the requirements for entry into the U.S., in other words, you've produced valid documents for yourself. They also review the documents that your sponsoring American relative has reviewed. By the way, your American relative who's sponsoring you does not get to go to this interview with you. He's not required to and will not even be permitted to. So once the consular officials complete your interview, and if everything's approved, you're issued an immigrant visa, which is generally valid for 6 months, and you can use that to enter the U.S. Upon arrival in the U.S., you end up getting a green card. Once you pay your immigrant visa fee, you're eligible to receive a green card, which confirms that you are a lawful permanent resident of the U.S. at this point. As I mentioned earlier, you also have people who apply for fiancé visas. In other words, someone who has not yet married a foreign national, but would like to do so. And there's certain categories of visas, K1, K3. You apply for a visa like this, and that once the visa is approved, and it takes months, you can bring your fiance to the U.S. and consummate your marriage in the U.S. In other words, get married in the U.S. People also go the route of where they marry locally and then apply for the immigrant visa. But given today's situation, I think very few Ukrainian refugees can afford to wait for months while any visa application that they apply for is approved, goes through all the process that I've just described. Generally, if you're a refugee, not only are you suffering often from PTSD, you're a refugee from a war zone, but you also have limited funds. Not to mention, you may only have the clothes on your back, literally, that you were able to leave with. So people want to be able to settle in a country where they're going to be given temporary protected status, a work permit so they can make a living, or some refugee benefits, financial stipends, medical insurance, temporary housing, and some of those things are available in many countries. But if you'd like to come to the U.S. as a refugee, then your options are as I mentioned. You can apply for humanitarian parole. You can put in your refugee applications. You can either do that at the embassy where you're located, the country where you're located, the U.S. Embassy, or you can do that by applying with USCIS. Or, as many Ukrainians have elected, you simply go to a port of entry, either by airport, but usually aircraft carriers will not allow you to board a plane to the U.S. unless you can demonstrate a document that authorizes your entry into the U.S. Because the airline, if they don't do that, they can face penalties. And they realize that if they deliver someone to the U.S. and they're not admitted, then they have to be sent back to where they came from. And that creates logistical and financial issues for the airline, not to mention for the person involved. So usually the port of entry that you can reach without having prior approval to enter the U.S. is the land border. So we're talking about Canada, we're talking about Mexico. Canada, most Ukrainians do not go to the U.S. through Canada because you can apply for temporary protected status in Canada. That has recently been announced in March of this year, 2022, where the Canadian government has made a commitment to allow Ukrainian refugees to seek refuge, to come to Canada for a year or two, I forget the exact amount of time, and receive a work permit, be able to work lawfully in Canada, and then later on be able to apply. I guess we'll see what the Canadian government will do that, but generally after that you can also apply for permanent residency. Canada is a country, just like Australia, are countries that are actively seeking immigrants because they're large countries with relatively small populations. Speaking of Australia, you can also try to travel to Australia. But this video is about providing legal services and legal assistance and advice to those Ukrainians who are seeking entry into the U.S. So generally the land port of entry that we're talking about is going to be on the American-Mexican border. I have to caution everyone that Mexico is not the safest country in the world, as you may have heard, right? And you really have to make sure that you do your homework and you have competent advice in reaching the border. Because what you don't want to happen to you is you don't want to be robbed on the way to the border, or heaven forbid, taken hostage by a criminal organization that's going to demand ransom from your relatives, by threatening your life. Unfortunately, we've seen videos where people lose fingers, limbs on video as an additional motivating factor, right, for whoever these videos are addressed to come up with ransom money. You can be killed, things like that. So don't take those chances. Make sure that you know exactly what you're doing. The other thing that I caution everyone about is taking the law into your own hands and violating U.S. federal laws by crossing the border illegally is not a sound, viable option. Regardless of how many people tell you, oh, we've done it, we've crossed the border illegally, either walked across the Rio Grande or, through some hole in the wall in the ceiling where there are walls and fences, right? Not ceiling, fences. And then we've presented ourselves to Customs and Border Patrol once we've crossed the border. That's not a recommended option. Remember, crossing the border should be done legally, and it should be done safely. If you want to take the chances of trying to cross the U.S. border with, so-called, what do they call them? Coyotes, people who help you cross the border, just look at all the news footage of people who tried to cross the border and ended up dying, either drowning in a river or dying of dehydration, or who knows what happened to them if their bodies were ever found. So you don't want to become a part of those grim statistics. There are organizations today in cities like Tijuana who are helping Ukrainian refugees stay in Tijuana safely, approach the border properly, get their turn in line, present their documents to US CBP so CBP can make a decision on whether to admit them to the United States or not. The decision on whether to admit someone to the United States, as I've said, is at the discretion of our agents at Customs and Border Patrol. And when they review application, obviously they're going to review to make sure that you are a valid, legitimate citizen of Ukraine or a resident of Ukraine. The other thing that they need to review is make sure you're not going to be a threat, right, to U.S. security. That means they are going to make sure that, if they can, to see if you have a criminal record, because we don't want to admit into the U.S. Murderers, robbers, rapists, drug dealers, who may be fleeing war zones, but they're still murderers, robbers, and drug dealers, or other criminals or people who've committed crimes of moral turpitude, and this falls under the category of federal felonies, and usually people like that are barred from entering the U.S. unless a certain decision is made at the discretion of the State Department or Department of Homeland Security. Those people can enter the U.S., but as an exception. They're also going to try to check if you constitute a health hazard. So if you're coming to the border and you have an active tuberculosis infection and you're coughing and you're spewing blood, the CBP officers do have the option to deny you entry because you're going to present a health risk. Same thing, if you have an active COVID-19 infection with all the symptoms, fever, things like that. That's what we have today. So if you need help with those services, don't hesitate. If you know Ukrainians, relatives, friends, acquaintances, colleagues, or your organization is interested in helping Ukrainian refugees settle in the U.S., feel free to reach out to our law offices. And we'll give you the appropriate advice, assistance, and if necessary, representation to make sure that you can arrive in the U.S. safely and legally and be able to stay and work in the U.S. safely and legally while this crisis resolves, or before you obtain lawful permanent residency and get on track of becoming a U.S. citizen eventually. Thank you. Look forward to helping you.